The moment we fear knowledge is the moment that our democracy is really imperiled. The world gets better and better with knowledge and grace, with understanding, with bringing people together, and with us giving kids the tools to seize their future. And knowledge is a big through line with all of that. And books help create knowledge and help foster creativity and excitement, but you're not going to read a book if you're not facile with reading.
It's important to be part of a union because you have to have a voice.
Welcome to Union Talk. I'm Randi Weingarten.
Welcome, everybody, to Union Talk. And today, I have the great honor of speaking to a real reading expert, Kelly Butler, who is one of the key architects behind Reading Universe. So probably a lot of you have never heard Kelly's name, but hopefully it will become a household name after this podcast. And you may have never heard about Reading Universe. And it is a free website platform. So I hope that you will go and look at it after this podcast. But all of this, what we're talking about today, is reading, and literacy. Now, why would a teachers union and a nurse union be so involved in reading and literacy? Because it's fundamental. If kids don't know how to read, if they're not fluent with literacy, if they're having challenges with letters, then they're not going to be able to seize the opportunities that they should be able to seize. This is key to all other learning. And so that's why it takes center stage to our campaign this year, which is a multi-million-dollar campaign about solutions for kids and communities. A lot of people in the education space are doing a lot of histrionics. We see problems, we see fear, we see smears, we see banning books, we see censoring of history, we see lots of defunding and lots of over-the-top attacks and a lot of undermining of the public schools that 90% of our kids attend. Now, I'm not saying, and in other podcasts, we have, responded to these smears and these fears and things like that. But today, we are talking solutions because underlying some of this is the fact that COVID created a whole host of new challenges that, layered on top of old challenges, have created real anxiety and agita for kids, for families, for educators. We have learning loss. When schools are closed, whether it was for 1 week or 3 months, or when kids were not going back full time for a year, there has been learning loss. We have learning loss in summers. There's been learning loss. But on top of learning loss, there's been loneliness. Kids have been really very focused on devices, which we needed during COVID to connect us. But there's been a lot of problems in terms of devices and social media and an addiction to that has made kids feel bad about themselves. And we need to address that. We need to create ways that schooling is fun and that we have kids who want to come to school. We need to rebuild relationships. And number one, we need to encourage the fun of reading, creating confident readers. And as I said before, reading is so important. It's the key to life. It's the key to our very existence. And books are the foundation of knowledge, of sharing information, of seeing new ideas, of being exposed to people and places we might never have seen. Reading books or newspapers, that's how we spark curiosity and stoke critical thinking. And that happens at every age. Reading a book, it can open a new world. Reading even a tweet. Reading a Facebook post. Reading a billboard. Looking at comics. Lots of different things are really, really open the world if you know not only how to read, but really understand reading and feel confident about that. So the AFT has been about supporting evidence-based reading instruction for decades through our professional development courses and resources like AFT's magazine, like Share My Lesson, like Collar in Colorado. And as many of you know, we, with First Book, have given away a lot of books. In fact, over the last several years, we've given away 9 million books. There's others banned books. We've been giving them away with our partner First Book because we want kids and families to enjoy the joy of reading, to have books at home, to be able to feel and touch them and make reading a family event, and for kids to be able to see themselves in books. So lots of different books with lots of diverse titles. But that learning to love to read is different than learning to read, and all the different kinds of steps through that. And so we have worked with WETA and the Barksdale Institute, and this guest, who hopefully, as I said, will become a household name, and First Book on we are just promoting this platform called Reading Universe. And it has been built from the start by Kelly and others to really help teachers help kids. So that if you're a teacher like me, who frankly took one introductory reading course, I taught high school, and when my kids were struggling with words or struggling with letters, I didn't have the deep knowledge to help them struggling with dyslexia. What Reading Universe does is it offers tutorials and videos filmed by real classrooms with real students in diverse settings to focus on these things, to help teachers, regardless of what curriculum teachers are using. And that is why I really wanted Kelly Butler to be on this show with us today, because I really want you to explain Reading Universe, why we do it, what Barksdale did in Mississippi, and what we are attempting to do.
Well, thank you, Randi. It's so good to be with you. And I want to applaud AFT for making literacy such a centerpiece of what you all do. And it's number one in your planning and thinking and doing. And so thank you for that. And you've been doing it a long time. So you were one of the first on the scene, even as the nation is now beginning to talk about this much more. You all have been there from the get-go. So
tell us about Barksdale, Kelly,
okay.
and tell us about you.
Okay.
Tell us about you and tell us about Barksdale, so everybody understands why I'm so excited to have you here.
All right. Well, the Barksdale Reading Institute was founded in 2000, which happened to be the same year that the National Reading Panel produced its report. Jim Barksdale and his late wife, Sally, committed $100 million to establish the Institute with the singular goal of lifting us off the state in early literacy. And what he meant by that was we had always been bottom, 49th or 50th, do-si-doing with Louisiana, depending on who had the last hurricane. And he put a stake in the ground and believed that we could do this. And I've told a story many times about his experience at FedEx, where he talked about getting package from the middle of Manhattan to the middle of Tokyo in 48 hours and tracking it along the way. And he said, if we can do that, we ought to be able to teach every child in Mississippi to read. And that's the work that the Institute has done. And when we started in the very beginning, back in 2000, this was even before Reading First and before lots of reading initiatives, we were working in schools and we were working in teacher prep, because one of the first things we thought we needed to look at was whether or not we were training teachers in the first place the right way to teach reading. And very quickly we determined that not only did our teachers in K-3 classes have very little preparation or knowledge of the science of reading, the faculty didn't know much about the science of reading. In fact, many of them had not read the national report and cared much about it. So that was really the birth of Reading Universe. We decided we had to do something, so we rolled our sleeves up and began to craft sort of a soup to nuts, everything you need to know about teaching reading. And because we were trying to expedite change, We created it in a 38-week series so that that's how many weeks there were in the school year. We were deploying coaches in schools to work with teachers, and we were spending a lot of money and time training those coaches so they were the best in the business. And we became the engine for the science of reading in the state. So the Reading Universe was essentially a scope and sequence for how you teach teachers to teach reading. And about 5 years ago, I called Noel Gunther up at WTA because he had been a champion of our work and had been interested in the Institute from the very beginning. And I really called him up just to seek some advice to say, can you help me build a website? I think it's time to move this to a platform that others can benefit from. He liked the taxonomy, and he said, I think we ought to partner on this. Well, hallelujah, because not too long after that, I discovered Jim made the decision about sunsetting the Institute, which happened at the end of June last year. And so we had a partner, and then First Book came on with us as well. And so we had two very strong partners to really take on this work and carry it forward. I'm continuing as a senior advisor to the work, but it really will live at WTA and among its suite of other award-winning literacy sites, as you know.
Well, I watched, we represent the educators in Jackson, Mississippi. And well before I knew your name, Kelly, or Barksdale, I watched how teachers were teaching reading in Jackson. And it was significantly different than in other places. Now, some of it was the difference in curriculum, and some of it was, the difference, there was lots and lots of places that were teaching still balanced literacy when Jackson was teaching the science of reading. But this is what I saw in Jackson with some of the classrooms I walked into. Teachers could explain to me what they were doing. And that is a huge difference. When you understand enough to explain to another adult what you're doing and why, you are really understanding the curriculum work and can troubleshoot what's going on with our kids. And that's what I see in Reading Universe. All too often, this is really, particularly those of us who learned reading at a very young age or learned how to read at a young age, it becomes an instinct as opposed to remembering how to learn. And these teachers were able to dissect, were able to explain, and were able to troubleshoot in a way that kids actually were learning the muscle of reading as opposed to the memorization of words.
Well, thanks for lifting that up, because that's exactly what Reading Universe set out to do, which was to teach teachers what the skill is, why it's important to reading, how it fits in with all the other skills of reading, and then show them how to teach it and how to assess it. And so back in the day where we were doing this in what we call peer coaching study teams, which were precursors to PLCs, we would meet once a week and take a bite of the apple, talk about the skill, demonstrate it, and then teachers would go back into their classrooms for the week, and we would coach them, model, co-teach with them, and then come back the next week, talk about, did it work? Why did it work? Why didn't it work? And then give another bite of the apple. And so our goal with Reading Universe is to put that all out there and let teachers access it wherever they are, at what point in their own development they are.
Which is what leads me to my next question. And we saw this in a survey AFT did with our members about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. And that's the little secret that I disclosed about my own teaching, that many teachers don't feel that they have all the tools and knowledge they need to help kids who either are, learning English, have challenges like dyslexia, reading below the grade level that the teacher is teaching. and they feel afraid of talking to anybody about it. And so they'll try to get kids to imitate and repeat what they're saying as words, but they don't feel like they have the tools and the knowledge. So what advice can we give these teachers who, are not in control of their curriculum? What can we tell them? What advice can we give them?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you, I'm not an expert in dyslexia or in EL, though I have special education training. I don't proclaim to be an expert in any of that. However, I do recognize that teachers struggle with this. I worry that too many of our teachers still are struggling with the garden variety, what we call the garden variety readers, and so we need to get them those basic tools. But in terms of the special populations you're talking about, the Reading Universe team has put together a group of really top-notch experts who are well-versed and know the research and the technology and the teaching methods for these populations so that we can address it head on. And Noel was very clear about that when I first contacted him and we began to put this thing together. He said, we don't want to make these kids an afterthought. They are often an afterthought. And so we built in the essential supports as a way to address those specific needs. So teachers should find answers to specific questions about those particular populations. And of course, then there are some other companion websites that WTA has, for example, Coloran, Colorado, as you well know.
Right.
But in terms of fixing the system, which is a piece of the question that I think is important to address, and I kind of tackle this from three angles. The first is we know it's an equity issue. And so there's some terrific organizations, AFT included, that are helping to give voice to this issue. National organizations like Ed Trust and state and local organizations like Kareem Weaver's work out in California.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking of a parent in Ohio, Brett Tingley, who created an organization called Parents for Reading Justice in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
The challenging part for her, and this is true for many parents, is they start out in a lawsuit. But what she did was she got her school board's attention and ended up getting her whole district of teachers the training and support they needed. And they are her biggest champions now because they got what they needed. And so that was a key thing. So I think it's an equity issue, and I think parents are helping to move the needle. And I think teachers, as they are asking for the support they need, we needed them to have a safe space to do that, because we need to recognize them that they are first and foremost champions of their kids. And this is not about their failure. It's about their kids' needs. So, second, I think it's putting the knowledge and tools in the hands of teachers and administrators on the ground now. And that's really what Reading Universe, we're hoping, is going to bridge the gap, is that it will be the go-to place when you have questions about any of those issues. It'll be the go-to place that you can find answers. And as teachers feed us these questions, we can also answer them directly and specifically, which we will plan to do. So your work in elevating the voice and stance of teachers is really critical to this, which brings me to my third fix. I know you and your members have plenty to pray over, but I want to enlist your help in addressing the pre-service teacher preparation issue.
All right.
We are seeing some promising signs in places, but it's way too slow and it's too voluntary. It's still up to those who sit behind the firewall of academic freedom to decide whether or not they want to change what they're doing. And I think we need to transform these engines who create the pipeline of our new crop of teachers every year. To me, it's just bad stewardship that we produce teachers who don't have the basic skills they need to do reading instruction on day one. It is possible to prepare a teacher within 6 to 12 hours of undergraduate coursework, the basics, methods that he or she needs in order to teach reading instruction. We have got to do something about this. And so, in fact, last night at our Share Our Lesson poll, I asked the question, when did you first learn about the simple view of reading? The most basic construct we have about what we know about reading. 5% learned it from teacher prep. The others learned it from their own professional development, the professional development that you all provide, and, seeking it on their own or from a mentor teacher. So that's an equation we've got to change. It's bad stewardship not to do it right the first time.
I think people were very surprised at my quote, which was essentially what you just said in the National Council of Teacher Quality, because that is a really big issue in terms of teacher preparation. I have some good news to share with you, though, which is that your words of wisdom are starting to be heard. And for example, New Paltz in the SUNY system now has a course that I'm actually even going to take as well on the science of reading and on trying to change the teacher prep paradigm here and construct here. And the fact that the State University of New York is doing it, there are other schools that are starting to do it as well. Columbia Teachers College is moving in this direction. And I think that our report from the Schenker Institute that Susan Newman wrote lifted this up as well, as is the National Council of Teacher Quality. So I think a lot of us are coming from a lot of sides to say we know what to do, but we need to help teachers in their formative moments really learn this. And all of us, not just, those of us who were in secondary education, there was a presumption that you didn't actually need a course on reading to get your teacher certification for secondary education. And so that also needs to be changed as well. And obviously, all the people who came in through alternative prep never got access to this as well. So I think that we are all, we're all speaking from the same hymnal, to borrow an analogy from this conversation. And I think that's really important. But the other piece that I thought was really important about what you said was that there's no blame here. We have to just change. And having a safe space like Reading Universe is a way to actually learn and have some access to the tools. So the equity issue also becomes an access issue. Yeah. And Reading Universe is changing that and thank you for being on our Share My Lesson webinar. That's another one of our platforms. And that's also how we're reaching out to new teachers and to not so new teachers in terms of what they can do.
Yeah. Right.
So do you feel positive? Or do you feel optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, I do feel like the needle is moving. But Randi, I've been doing this work with teacher prep for more than 2 decades. Now, we got some pretty high marks from the last round of National Council for Teacher Quality Review. But it's taken us 2 decades to get there. And that's too long. That's too many first grade classes. And so I'm trying to figure out, is there a way to accelerate this? And what I keep trying to do is to get teacher prep out in front of this parade. They need to be leading this charge. And as long as it remains voluntary, that's my concern about this. That's where I'm pessimistic, is that it remains voluntary. And it doesn't seem quite fair that we require 9-year-olds to pass a test before they can go to 4th grade. And we require 21-year-olds to pass a test before they can get their license. But the faculty, which is the bottom of this food chain, aren't required to change anything or know anything. And while they can dress up their syllabi, I think there needs to be greater accountability. And I know that higher ed is structured in a way that that academic freedom is a driving force. And I'm not opposed to academic freedom. I just don't think we've interpreted it accurately for this particular issue. And we know we have too much science now to ignore it, cognitive, hard science. And schools of education ought to be about the science as much as the philosophy.
Well, I think what's happening is, I would actually argue it a different way, as the largest union of higher ed educators. I think you're right about the science of reading, and I think that's the way in which we help drive this. I think that over the course of the last few years, there still has been a huge debate about balanced literacy versus the science of reading. And I think that it became too political, just like, when we had reading first, unfortunately, it was seen through the eyes of politics as opposed to the eyes of teaching instruction. Yeah. And I think what I'm seeing this year is a shift, even with all of the political noise that we have. I'm actually seeing a shift to more of the science of reading. And so I'm more optimistic that we can actually move in that direction. And that's why I raised the New Pulse course. There have been places within the SUNY system that, were very big adherents to balanced literacy instead of the science of reading. And I think that is shifting now too. Yeah. And if we can actually make this a core ingredient in terms of teacher prep and teacher certification, that's going to change things more quickly than I think either you or I think right now. Yeah. But I think we had to get over the hump of what's the pedagogy. Okay. And I think that has now happened over the course of the last year or two. Yeah. But watching you for all these years and, us as well, thinking about the elements of the science and being basically told that we didn't know what we were talking about. Yeah.
Well, and we have this pattern of waiting for things to pass. And yet what we now have is 50 years of codified research that we can stand on. And I think that thanks to Emily Hanford and AFT and others, the conversation has been significantly elevated where, policymakers are getting in the act now and all that for the good. So
right. I agree with you.
I appreciate and I'm grateful for your optimism.
Well, I'm not optimistic about everything, but I am optimistic about how this is moving. I was very struck by Susan Newman's report to watch how we didn't move, we just didn't go from balanced literacy and love of books to phonics. Right. We really, in many of these state laws, there's really the elements of, back to Goals 2000, back to the reading work that happened in 2000, we see that most of these laws now have several of the components that are needed in terms of reading. But one of the things I wanted to ask you before we got off the podcast was, what about books and all of this book banning and, this focus on what kids can and can't read? Is this surprising to you? Is there... you've been in the business of reading for a long time and about, what we need to do to help kids learn. Mm-hmm. But what do you make of all of this right now?
Well, to me, there's total irony in banning books when so many of us are desperately trying to get as many books as we can into the hands of as many kids as we can. So it's a real contradiction for me. Now, I will say that in making book selections, certainly common sense guardrails are good. Yeah. But crime tape.
And age appropriate.
That's right. But crime tape is not good.
Yeah.
And I understand the parent side of this as well. I mean, it's a troubled world out there. We're trying to raise, I'm not anymore, but parents, especially of young children and adolescents, are trying to raise children in a really crazy world. It's hard to navigate. But you mentioned social media earlier. It's interesting to me why there's not more backlash to that, the addiction to digital devices and social media as harmful sources of information. But that's another issue.
Really harmful.
Yeah.
common sense media, like we did, just did a report about how many notifications kids get per day.
Yeah.
Which, if you stop the notifications to kids for an elementary school day, we might be able to sever the addiction.
Well, and I think it's fueling this isolation and our inability to have dialogue at a very young age. I mean, that's part of the root. To me, it's the root of the problem of this banning issue, which is we no longer know how to talk to each other.
Right.
And I think censorship short circuits a really important thing we should be teaching our children, which is how to think critically, how to make good choices for themselves, and how to respect the choices of others. And how can you do that if all the choices are made for you? So
Right.
I think that's really troubling. As for teachers take it, as you well know, on the chin every day for all kinds of things, for everything. And this seems to be the latest and loudest. But we've been sending our children to schools and entrusting them to their teachers for generations. And now, but suddenly we've put teachers in the middle of this fight. And I just think somehow we're going to have to figure out how to restore the dialogue, which is the only way back to truth and trust.
Right.
The very institutions that we are entrusting our kids to should be safe spaces for learning and for teaching. So I think it has huge implications for the function of schools in general and for teachers in particular. When I thought about this question, I was reminded of my tenure, a previous chapter. I don't know if you know this or not. I presided over a national organization founded here in Mississippi called Parents for Public Schools.
Wow.
And we wrestled with a lot of issues. Book banning wasn't yet on the radar, but in anticipating this very question, I was reminded of an invocation that we used frequently because a particular phrase in it struck me as important to this issue of book banning. And the invocation goes something like this: may we have the grace not to sell ourselves short, grace to risk something big for something good, grace to remember that the world is now too dangerous for anything but truth and too small for anything but love.
Oh my God, I love that.
Well,
And
I
I
want to thank you
love
for your courage on this issue, because you've been a lightning rod, and it's you've done a terrific job. So,
well, thank you, Kelly. Look, I think knowledge is power. And I think when we're afraid of knowledge, of course, we have to be age appropriate. And I'm glad that there are these processes, because parents have to be involved and teachers have to be involved. And all too often, neither are involved. But the moment we fear knowledge is the moment that our democracy is really imperiled. The world gets better and better with knowledge and grace, with understanding, with bringing people together, and with us giving kids the tools to seize their future. And knowledge is a big through line with all of that. And books help create knowledge and help foster creativity and excitement. But you're not going to read a book if you're not facile with reading. Right.
And we want them later. If we don't build that knowledge now, then we
exactly
set them up for failure later.
I mean, I think we now have the statistic that less than 15% of kids just read for, because they want to.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what we're doing, and part of what First Book is doing, is trying to turn that around. So I have one more. This is a question we ask all of our guests, which is, who was the teacher who had the biggest impact on you?
Well, that's a hard one, and I'm wondering if your earlier guest could just name one, but
most could not.
Okay. Actually, there are two teachers that come to mind for me, and it's interesting because they're both 7th grade social studies teachers. One was mine back in the dark ages, and the other was my daughter's. And in my own experience, Mrs. Williford, after the first week of school, I earned myself a D on the first quiz of the year. And she took me aside. I remember the room. I remember the dress she was wearing. And she took me aside and persuaded me that social studies was really important and that it could be enjoyable. And furthermore, she expected more from me and that I should expect more from myself. And so one thing I remember from that year, and whenever Ethiopia is in the news, I think of a Haile Selassie.
Mm-hmm.
And Ms. Williford It was what I learned from that quiz that I failed. I learned later that he was an abolitionist and a Rastafarian. She totally turned that year around for me. And I think it was probably the first time I really thought of myself as a student.
Fantastic.
So I'm grateful to Mrs. Wilford. And then Mrs. Jackson came along 40 years later and taught my daughters. All three of my daughters went to the same middle school that I went to. And here's what I think about her. She taught my daughters how to draw a map of the world using geometric shapes that fit together. So what I remember about it, the U.S., of course, is just a big rectangle with the ice cream cone of Mexico attached to it. Don't forget the square of Alaska attached to the parallelogram of Canada. And Hawaii is a triangle with some chiclets in the ocean. You get the gist.
I love it.
Their impact was that learning mattered, learning was fun, they had high energy, and they cared about me as a learner, and they cared about my children as a learner. So they are treasures and memorable, and thank you for that question.
You're welcome. And as you were answering it, I was thinking about Mr. Swift, who was my 11th grade English teacher. And the first quiz I had in his class, or one of the first quizzes, which I, of course, was not prepared for, in big block letters, he wrote, it was about Caesar, and he wrote, A2 brute. Big block letters, because he was also the director of all of our theater groups, and I was part of those theater groups. So that level of disappointment that he had in me, I never was unprepared in that class again. And he became one of the teachers that when I became president of the National Union, I invited to come to be at that inauguration. He couldn't, unfortunately, but I wanted him to be there because here his student had become his union leader.
Well, I thank him too, because Randi, you are always prepared.
From that day on. So last question is, okay, if you had a magic wand when it came to reading instruction, what would you do with it?
Well, I guess for efficiency's sake, I would make sure every teacher, and regardless of what grade they taught or what subject they taught, and every school administrator and every school board member, the simple view of reading. I think it is a powerful construct that takes us far and far down the road. It is not everything we need to know. There is much more research since the simple view, but it is a very clear explanation of the reading process. And I think when teachers first learn about it, it helps explain a lot why some kids struggle to read, and it helps us then go to the next level and know where to go and work on it. Is it either decoding, or is it language, or is it both? So everywhere I go, I teach the simple view, and then I tell the audience, go home and teach your spouse or your dog or somebody else, because I think it's a really powerful construct that would accelerate change.
And to that point, I want to make sure that we have the simple view of reading on any of our websites and the work that we do so that people can have access to it. I think that becomes really important for us to do, and we'll make sure that people have access to it. And as we're talking about what we make sure that people have access to, I want to just say, not just thank you to Kelly, but I want to say to everyone who's listening, if you want to know anything more about Reading Universe, go to readinguniverse.org. And if you want to know anything more about AFT and our Real Solutions campaign, go to aft.org/Real Solutions. And all of these things are free. Reading Universe is free. That is what WETA has done. That is the work that Kelly and the Barksdale Institute have done. That's the work First Book has done. And that's the work that we are investing in to make sure that it's free. And ultimately, we want to make sure that every teacher has the tools and the skills that she, he, or they need to make sure they feel confident about the teaching of reading. Because at the end of the day, as Kelly and I both believe, reading is fundamental to everything that we do. So Kelly, thank you for being on with us today.
Thank you, Randy. It's great to call you friend, and thanks for all the teachers you represent.
Thank you. Really appreciate you.
Likewise.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Union Talk. Remember to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and tune in every other week for a new episode. Thank you, be safe, and be well.